The third speaker this afternoon will be Professor Carl Richard. Professor Richard is Professor of History at the University of Louisiana-Lafayette. He's done extensive research and writing on both American history and classical studies, and in fact, a number of his works bridge the gap between the two. One that came out in 1994 is entitled The Founders and the Classics, Greece, Rome, and the American Enlightenment. And today he's going to be giving us a short presentation on the founders and their stories.
Yes, Gleaves asked, he said, can you speak off the top of your head for a few minutes? And I said, I'm a professor. What do you think? That's what I do. So my remarks, because they're sort of unprepared, will be, fortunately for you, brief and informal, but hopefully of some use, because I think it'll maybe serve as a good bridge to my more formal presentation in the next segment. I thought I would talk about something that's very important. I think the importance and power of stories. I think that the human mind is hardwired to love and appreciate good stories, and we tend to remember stories much better than we do other forms of information. As teachers, those of us who are teachers know this. Our students will remember a good story long after they've forgotten everything else. I remember one time I was giving a lecture on the Protestant Reformation, and I started with a very brief story about how Martin Luther became a monk, a story of the lightning and all of that. And then I went on for 20 minutes to talk about his doctrines and distinguish them very carefully from Catholic doctrines. Well, when it came time for the review for the next exam, I had a student raise her hand. She said, if we get Martin Luther as a term on the exam, what should we write? She said, all I have in my notes is that he was struck by a bolt of lightning. Well, and so, to this student, she could not distinguish Martin Luther from Lee Trevino or a park ranger, I guess. But she remembered the story, didn't remember much of anything else. And but that's the way we are. We tend to remember stories. And that's why Jesus told so many parables. Each time to illustrate his point, he would tell a parable. Stories tell us a lot about ourselves. The stories that a society tells a lot about that society. The concerns of that society, the principles of that society, we can really discern from its stories. We get a lot from our stories. We get our heroes come from our stories, our villains, our lessons. We'll go back to that word again, lessons. It's become a trend in academia to sort of downplay the idea of learning lessons from history, and there's good reason for that, because it's been abused, as we've talked about here, and sometimes people will act as though history repeats itself exactly, and therefore you can take a lesson from one period and apply it directly to another, and of course that's not true. But it's still the idea of learning at least general principles from history. I think it's very doable and very important. So we get all of these things from our stories. Where do our stories come from? Well, for centuries before television and film and radio, they came from books. That's where the society stories came from, in the West at least. Bible stories were very popular, and people knew that was their shared information, were Bible stories. But as Tracy pointed out with the Founding Fathers, there's a whole different source of stories, maybe the most important source of stories, were the stories they got from the Greek and Roman classics. Why is that? Well, Tracy touched upon this. Their educational system was heavily classical, emphasized Greek and Latin. And this began at a very early age, 6, 7 years old. They would begin either under a tutor, private tutor, or at a grammar school. And that's the interesting thing about, we throw that word around even today, grammar school. But you know that the term grammar school, the grammar in grammar school did not refer to English grammar. It referred to Greek and Latin grammar. They didn't begin teaching English grammar until after the American Revolution. And even then, there were many people who said we shouldn't be wasting time in school teaching English grammar. That's kid stuff. You learn that from your mama. You come to school to learn serious things like Greek and Latin. And so from the very early impressionable age, the founders really imbibed this whole history and culture as though it were their own, even though it was, several thousand years old. And that's where they got many of their stories. And then many of them went on to college where their training was even more rigorous in Greek and Latin. Well, of course, our stories are not the founders' stories. You ask the average person today what they know about Rome, for instance. What do you know about Romans? And they'll say, well, I think they walked around in bed sheets and had British accents. So they get from film, our stories are not the founders' stories. And the ironic thing is that the founders are partly responsible for this because they gave us something that they themselves didn't have, which was a set of national heroes and stories associated with those heroes. We speak of Washington and the cherry tree, or as Washington spoke of Cincinnatus and the plow. So by giving us themselves as a set of national heroes and stories about themselves, they ironically did something that they would not have wanted to do at all, which is to partially at least displace the ancients. But I don't think it's the main reason. I think the main reason why their stories are not our stories is because of the dramatic change in the educational system, which began really in the late 19th century for a variety of reasons that I won't really go into. And it was gradual. Even well into the 20th century, high schools typically taught Latin. And even today, of course, we have academies that still teach Latin. Homeschoolers, many of them teach Greek and Latin. So it's a relative thing, this decline, but it's definitely a reality. Certainly we're not living in the days of the founders where almost every child was taught Greek and Latin. So there's been a significant decline. Well, what are our stories now? I think the source of our stories today is mostly film and television. And I'm not here to put down film and television. I think they can be very powerful media. The visual image can be very, very powerful, and there are certain advantages to these media, but there's no question that they are, by their nature, they're inherently more shallow. A 2-hour film is inherently more shallow than a book. You just simply cannot go into the same level of detail. And so I think that's the troubling aspect. We still have stories, we still have very good stories today, but they tend to come from media that I think are inherently more shallow. And I think that's the challenge for us today is to at least partially try to return to a richer media for these stories, because every society has to have them. They're vital. And so I think my advice, since we're all giving unsolicited advice to President Obama, my advice, but also for my fellow citizens, not just the president, is to do what the founders did. Return to stories that were rich in meaning, that were versatile. These were deep sources that they tapped into, and I think that's what we need to do. I think we need to once again mine these rich veins of the classics.